Hello and welcome, Dave West, the CEO of Scrum.org. Thanks a lot, Dave, for taking the time to talk with us here in Latin America. We're very excited about the guide. It's just a few days old. We're very excited to have you here talking to us. So with that, I would say let's dive straight into the interview or the conversation. First of all, thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you, Fabian, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I wish it was in person because then we could be having a fantastic time. But in the 2020, I think remote, this is as best as we can do. So hopefully, though, we can use this as an opportunity to talk about the Scrum Guide, and perhaps people that wouldn't be able to come to a face-to-face event can benefit from some of it. So every cloud has a silver lining, maybe.
Yeah, right. I think we have advantages and disadvantages. Well, let's focus on the advantages. We have people from all over Latin America connected, so from every country in Latin America, even from Spain. So so I think that could be or will be a very interesting event. But before we dive into the changes, maybe very few introductory questions. Tell us a little bit about who is Dave West. Well, you're the CEO of Scrum.org. You have a big in the community, but who's the person Dave West?
So hello, my name's Dave. Yeah, I'm based, for the people that don't know, in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm actually in Burlington, just outside Boston. I'm actually in the office. I'm the only person in the office. So because we're not allowed more than a few people. It's interesting, a story about this office before we talk about me. This was, depending on who you ask, the second or third Scrum project ever was literally in this building. Wasn't in this office, it was actually down below in the cheap offices that are below sort of like the ground, because they couldn't afford nice fancy windows. But it was Patient Keeper was actually in this very building. I asked whether they could put a plaque in as we hit the 25-year anniversary, and they said, "What's Scrum?" and "No." Was pretty much their answer. Though one day I'm going to get one of those, those blue plaques that you get in, like you see them in New York City, and some famous person lived here. Alexander Hamilton was born here, or whatever, that sort of stuff. We're going to get that. And Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland. Jeff lives in Concord and Ken lives in Lexington. So this is a sort of place where much of that began, as it were. But anyway, who am I? So I'm Dave. I run Scrum.org for Ken Schwaber, the creator of Scrum. If you don't know Scrum.org, it's, we have a community of about 340 trainers all around the world, of which Fabian is one of them, which is great to see. And before COVID, they trained about 7,000 people a month. And then we do certifications. There's about 12,000, 15,000 people taking those every month. And then obviously with the home of Scrum, the body of knowledge around Scrum, which is really, really exciting. I came to Scrum.org about 5 years ago. I've known Ken for probably almost 20 years, 18. When I met him, I was the RUP product manager. Can you believe that, Fabian? I was in charge of the rational unified process. And the first things he said to me was, "You're an idiot." Turns out he was right. He did laugh when he said it, otherwise perhaps we wouldn't have become friends. And then over the years, as I was working with Ivar Jakobsen, who some of you may know from the use cases, we met at a number of events and we started talking, me and Ken. And then I was an analyst at Forrester and I ended up running the app dev practice and I covered Agile. So Ken and I did a lot of presenting together actually during that time. Well, that's when we really got to know each other. And then he's, been a mentor for these last 18 years. And then finally I realized he was interviewing me the whole time. And so about 6 years ago, he offered me the job. It took a bit of time for me to disentangle myself from the startup I was involved in. But then I came and helped him initially. And now I'm running the organization myself. Ken's sort of semi-retired. He's that kind of retired that you find every sprint review comes in with an absolutely amazing insight that can pull the rug from under you. So he's still involved. He still comes to sprint reviews. He still provides input on the planning. And obviously he owns scrum.org along with his wife, Chris. So they're still involved, but they don't get involved in the day-to-day, and I do. Was that okay, Fabian? Does that answer who is Dave West?
I didn't know the Rupp story. It's a good story. I think we can use that.
Well, it's funny because obviously Rupp was, in my opinion, awesome. However, I realized after a while that it wasn't adding value. And I think that's what Ken was really focused on. There was this very prescriptive methodology that ultimately didn't necessarily work for everybody and therefore didn't work for anybody. And part of the essence of the Scrum Guide 2020 update is to sort of take it back to the framework, to go back to its roots and to make it as simple and applicable to everybody as it possibly can be. So I think, you know, what we suffered from with Rupp was a proliferation of practice after practice and technique and that. And Scrum has said, well, that's great, but ultimately that doesn't, you know, the framework is what's important, the essence of it. And so the Scrum Guide's gone back to its roots.
Okay, well, that's a good and great introduction with a funny insight. You mentioned scrum.org, and today with all these, well, there are lots of Scrum organization entities out there. Would you like to talk a little bit about what is scrum.org? What is scrum.org doing?
Yeah, it's interesting. So scrum.org's, you know, almost 10 years old, I guess. The 2000, oh no, I guess it's 12 years old. My math is not good, so I apologize. Ken founded scrum.org after he left Scrum Alliance. So when Scrum was created 25 years ago, it was very much in response to Jeff and Ken working together on projects, right? You know, Jeff was often the CTO, he'd bring in Ken, they'd work together on trying to do something, build a piece of software, etc. And slowly over time, Scrum got documented initially by Ken, and then Jeff added, and then the Scrum Guide was created, right? So what's interesting is, you know, they signed the Agile Manifesto. Then Ken and a few others created the Agile Alliance. They were founders of that. Ken quickly realized that though it was a fantastic organization and continues to be amazing, it wasn't delivering on his expectations of a very tight-knit community, you know, working together and training and educating people on what he thought Scrum. Obviously, Agile Alliance is broader than that. He then formed Scrum Alliance. Now, and Scrum Alliance, you know, is, you know, our success is on their shoulders. I'll be very honest about that. And Scrum Alliance focused on certain things. Scrum Alliance and Ken didn't necessarily agree where the direction was going around training and around certification and the importance of a body of knowledge and those things. And so then he created scrum.org. Ultimately, though, I believe we're all in this together, whether it's Agile Alliance, Scrum Alliance, or Scrum.org. We approach it from a different perspective. We believe in the separation of, you know, these tests. We believe in, you know, our community model is a little different, and obviously, you know, we're focused very much on building the body of knowledge around Scrum and adding more information around Scrum every day. On our website and in other channels. So that sort of gives you an evolution of where we're at. That's where the Scrum landscape is, Fabian, today, I think. Oh, I think you might be on mute. To click that little mute button. There we go.
The phrase of the year, probably.
Yes. Probably is the most used phrase in 2020. Yeah.
Yeah, so that is a very interesting overview, particularly for people in Latin America. We have lots of organizations. Some are more known than others, so it's always interesting to know about the organizations that are working worldwide, not just locally. So thanks for the introduction to scrum.org. And if you don't mind, let's go and talk about the Scrum Guides, the actualizations. Maybe before we dig into detail, would you maybe like to give us a broad overview of the changes?
Yeah, let me, obviously I'll send these to you. Oh, this is interesting before we get to changes. Look, this is the original 25 years ago, 19th of October. It's a horribly bad image, but this is the original conference proceedings of the first time Scrum development process was documented. It was over 130 pages long, Fabian. Can you believe that? And notice Scrum is in uppercase. When I asked Ken why it was in uppercase, he said, because nobody had heard of us, so I had to shout. And I thought that was interesting. And for the first 5 years of Scrum's life, everybody thought it was an acronym. And you'll see some like in 96, 97, there'll be, articles that are written that have still managed to survive through the mists of time, where people have actually said software, computer requirements, something method. Is that what it is? You can see the debate about it wasn't an acronym, never meant to be an acronym. And I just thought that was very funny. So I just had to share that with you. Hang on. I wanted to get to this slide. Hopefully you can see it. So this is actually on scrumguides.org. So if you go there, you'll see this written in a few more words, but I'll just say it. What they said about this update was they highlighted 7 really big important things. The first one was around prescription. And what would happen? So when the first Scrum guide was, when the first Scrum product was documented, framework was documented, it was really a methodology then in 25 years ago at Uppsala. It was over 130 pages. It had like phases. It had, all these different roles and jobs. It had lots of detail. It was very prescriptive, and it was prescriptive for object-oriented, we would call it now Agile. It was called RAD, Rapid Application Development, and it was very much focused on that world. Now, over time, that has been clear that the more prescriptive you are, the less the harder it is to use. Does this work in this context? Does this work in this context? You have to start dropping things. Now, over those 25 years, Scrum has become used in so many different contexts. So just around the corner here, at the Broad Institute, Scrum was used to basically build a COVID-19 test lab within 5 days. It was documented in Nature magazine. The lady that ran it, or drove it, the Scrum master that drove it, is a bit of a rock star. And Scrum's being used in a very different environment. It's CRISPR uses it, Tesla uses it, SpaceX uses it, the Volvo uses it. You name it, organizations are using it. Marketing organizations, HR professionals use it. It's used. I'm even helping a friend of mine to run her animal hospital using it, which is crazy, right? You were like, what the heck? So the problem we had with the previous guides is that it become quite prescriptive, not necessarily in detail, but in orientation. So it was prescribing, hey, maybe the 3 questions. Hey, every sprint has to have an improvement item from the previous sprint. Those things had sort of crept in. Now, most of those things are really good, and you probably should use them. However, they're not always. It's like refinement. Do you always have to do refinement? Well, 99 times out of 100, you probably should. However, there's always going to be a case like first sprint maybe where you don't do it, or it's possible that you've got this one big thing and you're working on it. The bottom line is that prescription can end up being a problem, because people can, well, I don't want to do this, I'm going to drop this, I'm going to drop the daily, and suddenly the framework becomes less valuable. So it's less prescriptive, which is super interesting. I'm actually more interested than the next 2. One team focused on one product. Now, you may have heard me talking about, the importance of product goal with JJ Sutherland at the event. So, and these 2 are sort of linked. Scrum is not about work. Even though we sort of talk about work, you talk about a backlog, you talk about, talk how you're doing, you're talking about storming, all these things. It's about outcomes. And one of the problems that we had with the previous descriptions in the guide was we had a development team who were very much focused on delivering a valuable increment, or, you know, potentially shippable increment, if we use the termage of those years. And we had the Scrum team, and then we had the Scrum Master and the product owner, all had clear accountabilities and responsibilities. However, the product owner and the Scrum Master were not accountable for delivering value. The product owner was responsible for ordering value, but ultimately the development team and the Scrum Master, well, they just served, right? That sort of got in the way. This change definitely highlights the importance of building a team of which you have 3 primary roles: developer, Scrum Master, product owner, and with clear sort of accountabilities and responsibilities, and focusing on a goal and getting them to deliver value. That's the whole point of it, right? And so by getting rid of the development team, we avoid that confusion. Now, realistically, Fabian, as you well know, all the companies you work with, that problem might not manifest itself. You know, a good Scrum Master cares deeply about the value the team's delivering. A good product owner is invested in delivering value along with the team. However, the Scrum Guide, you could interpret it that. And we had a large petrochemical company that I was talking to, and they said, "How do we measure our Scrum Masters?" Because they don't want to be measured by the success of the team. They want to be measured by, you know, engagement, their services that they provide, and how effective their services are perceived to be. And that's, I think, not necessarily the right thing to do. You should focus. A good Scrum Master helps you deliver value. Bottom line, it's clear. And now it's a lot more clear in the Scrum Guide, which then brings us to product goal, the next thing that was introduced. So there was 3 commitments were added. Now, 2 of the commitments were already in the Scrum Guide, definition of done and sprint goal, but now they've all been put in a better place, in a tighter place. An additional, though, commitment to the artifact product backlog is product goal. Now, what's interesting about product goal is that it really does double down on this focused on delivering value, because a product goal ultimately has a series of characteristics. It has some way of measuring, right? Yeah, I mean, you have to know whether you've scored or not. Obviously, we're in South America, so you know football, soccer. I'm a Leicester fan, so I'm a little bit depressed after yesterday's poor performance. But yeah, so you know when you score. Now, Leicester did not score enough yesterday. So you have probably a clear customer. You know, there's some outcome associated with it. Goal provides us with a clear sort of directional idea of what we're trying to achieve. And there's only one, which means you have to make a choice. So the product goal, which is part of the product backlog, defines that direction for the team. And that allows self-management and empowerment to happen at the team level. Because what I've noticed is if you give a team the autonomy, great, but you also give them a purpose, you'll get a much more fluid self-management. Instead of focusing on the work, you focus on the purpose or the goal, and that provides that clarity to allow them we used to say self-organize, now we self-management. And product goal, along with definition of done and sprint goal, a definition of done, part of the increment, sprint goal, part of the sprint backlog, all provide commitments that provide extra clarity around those artifacts. They provide us with a target almost around those artifacts. Definition of done's target is predominantly focused on what it means to be a done increment, what it means to be usable by your customers, what it means to be of an appropriate level of quality. That's a great target for your increment. Sprint goal is the target for the team, for the Scrum team, for this period of time, whether it's a week, whether it's 2 weeks, as long as it's less than 30 days, we're all good. 3 other things: self-managed over self-organized. I don't know about you, Fabian, but I'm less into that sort of intellectual debate about self-managed, self-organized. Both those terms are used synonymously in the English language, I find. And I can find definitions that actually describe both the same way. However, the reason why Ken and Jeff changed this when I asked them was because they wanted to highlight the importance of the team, the Scrum team, owning all the management tasks necessary to deliver value. So to deliver the useful, usable increment, all the things necessary. Now, in some organizations, that's going to be a bigger list than others. I ran the engineering organization in a startup, managed product at a startup, and our teams were very self-managed. They were responsible for hiring, they were responsible for everything, because that's what we decided was necessary to deliver the product, to deliver the done increment. In other situations, there's different, and we didn't have any managers in that situation. For you guys, and in different companies, maybe you're a big bank, you have some managers that can help. Therefore, that definition of what self-managed means to you will be different. However, don't get into the pedantics about self-managed versus self-organized. Just focus on the outcome. The team is allowed to do what's necessary, to take ownership of what's necessary to deliver the done increment. And that's super, super important. 3 planning, sprint planning topics. Well, that's because we now added a topic around the why are we doing this? The sort of bringing in that sort of goal concept. And then the last thing is the summation of everything. Hopefully, and now obviously, this is in English, but we're translated. I think when we launched, it was like 25 or 30 languages, and that continues to grow every day. So the simplification of language is particularly important when you translate. What we found, and our translators were providing very big feedback on this, that the 2017 Scrum Guide had some opportunities for ambiguity around language. We've really, or Jeff and Ken have really tried to zone in on the language. Say it once, say it clearly, no passive voice, if you understand that sort of English term, reduce the numbers of commas and long, complicated sentences, and keep it very focused on the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And we think that will make it more usable by a wider audience. Part of that is dropping all the software development terms that sort of were in it by accident or on purpose, to make it again more simple to use for a wider audience. The bottom line for all of this is that it's a framework. That means you have to use your brain. That means you have to instantiate it. Those things that were dropped might still be valuable. You may decide to use the 3 questions. I'm more of a walk aboard kind of guy, but you may decide to use the 3 questions. You may decide that every sprint has a process improvement element. You may decide, many of the things that were sort of the potential shippable is still really relevant to you. That's okay, because you have to instantiate that framework in your context. But hopefully the Scrum Guide provides you with the foundations to ask those questions of your process to make it work to deliver value to your customers at least every 30 days, and hopefully a lot quicker than that. So that I think, does that give a good enough overview, Fabian? I don't know. I sort of waffled on a bit.
It was a great overview. It was absolutely great. I actually saw you flipping through some slides while you arrived here. That slide. Are there any other slides you would like to share before we dig deeper into?
No, I don't think so. I obviously will provide them after the event. You can have a look at them. They really just set the context. The reality. There's some slides. Why is Scrum being used so much? We have about 1.5 million people come to our website every month, and I'm sure there's even more people using Scrum around the world every day. And the reason why is because we live in this very changeable world. Scrum.org has always used Scrum, right? However, I had a really, on the wall, I used to have my roadmap for 2020, right? And even though we were incrementally moving towards that, I had this, I had these big rocks that I knew and everything was fine. Now I realized that actually we have to incrementally, we do have a roadmap, but it's very aspirational and goal oriented, as opposed the quarterly, monthly, and then every 2 weeks where we do our planning cycle, I'm refining that roadmap because of this situation that COVID has presented itself with us. And so I'm learning and changing and refining. I think the reason why, so many of those slides talk about that, about this pivot that we're in and the importance of Scrum in regard to that. And then we do a little bit of celebration of 25 years, all thanks to you, people on this call or on this webinar. And then the slides after this are really detailing the things I've just talked about around the framework improvements. So we can always double down on those if we want to have spend more time on the product goal or whatever, Fabian.
Okay, cool. Great. And first of all, thanks for the overview. Second, I like that you say that these are the more important changes. There are more changes. There are probably some changes. I think one of the most discussed changes in my area here is the change of the daily Scrum. But let's talk about it a little bit later. I would maybe you have to correct me if I say something wrong, but I understand Scrum is still the same Scrum. But the update helps us to have a clearer language, to be more concise, to get more straight to the point, to make it more understandable. So we didn't change Scrum, or Ken and Jeff didn't change Scrum. They just adjusted the guide to better explain Scrum, maybe.
Yes. I just want to spend a little bit of time on that, Fabian. Yeah, that's exactly right. Scrum is still Scrum. If you're being successful with it, if it's delivering value to you, you probably, you're great. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Look at the 2020 guide and just use it as a refresher to say, oh, why are we doing this? Oh, this isn't in the guide. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? There's been a lot of things that have slowly crept into Scrum. I know that, Ken, part of his desire, and this was really driven by Ken more than Jeff, I think, his desire to have a body of knowledge, to have that clear, this is Scrum and this isn't Scrum. To have that clarity was super important to him, and hence the reason why he created the Scrum Guide. Now, that doesn't mean that the practices that you're applying on top of Scrum, that doesn't mean that the things that you're doing are necessarily bad. They might be incredibly valuable for you to do it. As it's a framework, not a process. You have to instantiate it. But Scrum is still Scrum. And Scrum's only three things, Fabian, really. It's empirical, which means that you basically break things down into smaller things and then do something on that, learn from it, and then change your plans and your experience based on that. So empirical process. Secondly, it's about empowered self-managed teams. This idea of allowing teams to really do the art of the possible, freeing them from the shackles of an industrial mindset around process and systems. And then the third thing is around continuous improvement. You're continuously improving based on your learning. You improve the product and you improve how you work. That's Scrum. Now the framework instantiates that, or provide you with the foundations. You then instantiate into your process. If the things you're doing don't compromise any of that, then you're still doing Scrum, and hopefully you're being super successful because of that.
I think that's great. Scrum, so like the three points of Scrum is a pretty good, fast, and easy explanation. I think I will use that maybe later. Now I would like to ask the following question, but let me put the context. So if Scrum hasn't changed, and it's just the guide changed, but Scrum hasn't changed. I would like to quote something. I don't know who said that, but I heard something like that. The worst enemy of good Scrum is not RUP or some traditional project management method. It's bad Scrum. So now assume, like, if you were doing good Scrum before the 2020 Scrum Guide update, well, assume you will still do good Scrum, and the change in the guide doesn't affect you probably at all. But what happened if you weren't doing good Scrum, and the clarification in the guide now cause you to rethink, okay, well, maybe there's something we would have to change. Maybe we need an overall product, or maybe we have to make sure that the Scrum Master is not just a secretary for the team. Maybe we have to review some points. How would you implement those changes?
I mean, I think, Fabian, that's the great opportunity that you have with the 2020 guide, right? Get the team together, get yourself some coffee. Obviously in Colombia, that's the best thing to drink in the world, right? You get yourself some Colombian coffee, you sit down with the team, and you take the Scrum guide, print it out or leave it on the tablet if you're caring about your environment. You read it through, do a little reading circle, and then talk about it and talk about the things that are different. Talk about the things that it sort of highlights. Maybe make a list. Oh my God, maybe a backlog of these things that you think are different, or that's made you think of something different. Try not to get into the blame game, Fabian, because it's really easy to say, why haven't we got a product goal? Well, that's obviously the fault of the product owner because he's an idiot or she's an idiot. Why haven't you told us who the customer is? Why have we got no definition of done? Why have we, the list goes on. Why do we not have a sprint goal, but in fact, just a list of things we're going to do this sprint? Why do we, why, instead of sort of, are we idiots? What are you doing? Don't do that. Do not get into that. Throwing mud is only good if you're 4 years old. As my 4-year-old proves regularly, but nobody else should be throwing mud. Instead, let's use this as an opportunity. Let's not look at the why in terms of apportioning blame, but look at the opportunity that these things get. So maybe we say, hey, the new product goal. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Maybe the sprint goal becomes something we talk about because now it's a commitment. So we realize that we have to have one. Maybe it's definition, or maybe it's product, whatever those things are. Maybe it's a conversation around the ownership of the team, the management of the team, and how we're working there. So you get that list of those things, and then what I always do is, I talk about them, and then maybe we do some dot voting on them. Maybe we prioritize them in some way. What are the things that we could actually maybe next sprint pick up on and change? Maybe it's introduction of a product goal. So, and that's not the thing about the product goal, though it is owned by the product owner, the team works with the product owner to form it and to refine it and to look at it and say, is this right? So maybe you sit down, spend an hour, you get your product goal, which clearly defines who your customer is, clearly defines the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, and clearly defines the measures that are necessary. I'm a big fan of SMART, in terms of things like goals, and then brings that together. We try it for a sprint. And then at the sprint review with stakeholders, we say, hey, this was our product goal. This was our sprint goal. And the stakeholders go, hey, that's interesting. I never thought about that. And they help you improve it so that then we continually refine it. So maybe it's that. So I guess what I'm saying is, don't use this as an opportunity to throw mud at each other or be rude about why things aren't working. Maybe Fabian was having a bad day that day when he taught you these ideas. I don't know. Not really. But use it as an opportunity to learn. Get together, sit down, grab a coffee, grab a pizza, grab a beer. That's what we do in England, obviously, because we're so bad at making anything else now. We would have a beer and we would sit down, we'll talk about it, maybe identify the big changes, the things that are interesting, and understand the impact to us, and then maybe prioritize them, and then maybe do something to take something and try it. I probably product goal will go up to that list, because one of the interesting things about product goal, as an example, is that I used to spend a lot of time visiting Scrum teams. Now I do it virtually. It's not the same, and I don't get as many dinners out, so I'm very depressed. But I remember Brazil. I was in Brazil last year in São Paulo, which is a fantastic city, and I love being there. And I visited a bunch of really cool organizations doing really cool work, and they were using Scrum and reasonably successful. They were dealing with challenges, but they were doing good stuff. And I realized they had great Scrum boards. They even were maybe using some Kanban stuff on top. Maybe they had, aging, maybe they were using cumulative flow, maybe they were looking at their work, WIP limits of, so they were doing some really cool stuff, but none of them had a clearly articulated customer and goal for the product, for why they were there. And so I realized that quite quickly. And so I started asking, I said, so why are we here? What's the objective of the product? We didn't use product goal in those days. That's a really good, what's the vision for the product? What are we trying to achieve? And it was very clear that many of the people on the team had different opinions of why they were there. And so I think product goal is going to be perhaps the biggest positive impact that comes from this Scrum Guide update. Now, I'm not saying that many of you aren't doing this already. I'm sure some of you are. And obviously, professional Scrum with UX, the work that we did with Jeff and Josh, the authors of Lean UX, we have a class on that was motivated by the need of delivering outcomes and reforming backlogs to make them more outcome oriented. So we aware of this for a long time, but by putting it into the Scrum Guide, by having that conversation over coffee or beer, and by looking at how you can implement that product goal, for example, you can suddenly make a huge marked impact on how you're working. Remember Dan Pink, autonomy, mastery, purpose, right? Purpose. We find over and over again, purpose. You look at the new product game. Those teams had a clear idea of the mission they were on. Look at organizations like SpaceX and Tesla. There's many things that they do relatively badly or have done badly, but what they do really well is they focus on the mission. And I think that's what's so exciting. That's the reason why, I'm excited about spaceflight again. That's the reason why I drive a car. Well, actually, it drives me to the office most days, which is very good, because this driving on the wrong side of the road thing really confuses me. So we live in this world where if you have a clear purpose and mission, everything else, that's easy, right? That's how we do against it. And anyway, so that's how I would work, Fabian. Get everybody together. Let's read the document and let's start working out which bits we can improve.
I think that's a great strategy. Actually, your last call reminded me of I was living in Australia for a while. Almost killed me because they were driving on the other side. That's
totally normal for me, mate. But I've lived here 20 years, Fabian. I finally worked it out. But it's funny because my car is better driver than me. And so I'm like, interesting.
Is it a Tesla or is it another?
It's a Tesla. I'm fortunate enough to have an X. That is my one indulgence. And I went from a Honda Accord to an X. And the thing about the X that from a Scrum point of view, they obviously at Tesla use Scrum, and that what's great about it is that they're continuously inspecting and adapting. They push things out. Obviously, their definition of done has a very clear quality, in terms of safety, but they will push things out that aren't necessarily as, how can I describe it, thought through as you might expect. And they continuously do that. You look at their competitors, BMW, Volvo, all also using Scrum now and starting, but they're a long way behind that, because you have to have the mentality of that hypothesis-driven development, that mentality of focusing on a goal and then delivering stuff to learn. Lean UX changed my life in terms of how I frame product backlogs and how I think about the work that we do. Now, sometimes I make mistakes and I'm not as good as it as I should be, but I'm always trying to learn. And yeah, it's an interesting thing. But yes, I'm fortunate enough to drive a Tesla, much to my wife's annoyance. Don't mention it, because she's like, really? That's ridiculously expensive, David. I'm like, oh well, it's my one indulgence.
Great car. I'm German, so I have to drive a German car.
Well, yes, you do. And by the way, BMW, Mercedes, and Porsche's just brought out a beautiful electric car. Unfortunately, it's ridiculously expensive, but it's Porsche. And and a little too long. It's actually longer than my X, which is a little annoying. Anyway, we're not going to go into an interesting conversation, Fabian, about cars, even though I know we would love to.
So there's a you're right. Let's focus on on the goal. So and there's a minor change I would like to mention, and I would like to mention it because of the following situation. So we see in our clients, we see lots of good Scrum Masters, but in many occasions we have seen Scrum Masters that are seriously reduced to basically scheduling meetings for the teams and maybe going to the retrospective and making the retrospective fun for the team, like selecting some funny games for the retrospective. Now, not that that is not maybe something important, but I found that that is reducing the Scrum Master to something he, in my opinion, wasn't supposed to be. And discussions, for example, that we have because of that as well, it's really expensive to have a Scrum Master for each team. Well, yeah, if the Scrum Master doesn't improve the team performance, then it's probably very expensive. So I think this was never meant to be like that. It's just that the new Scrum Guide did a minor change, but I understand it was done exactly to correct this understanding. In the English version of the Scrum Guide, in the 2017 version, it said the Scrum Master is a servant leader.
Yeah.
People focused a lot on servant and forget the leadership part. And now it says it's a real leader that serves the team, something like that.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
more on the leader. So I have two questions in that context. First, what do you think about that change? Why was that made? And the second question is, now if you have this situation that your Scrum Master is basically a team secretary, how do you change that?
Okay, so yes. Okay, so you're exactly right, Fabian. The reason why servant leader was changed was predominantly because of that. The first Scrum Masters, as it were, I think Ken was probably the first Scrum Master, Jeff would say, and he is not anybody's servant. He would get other people to schedule all the meetings because he cared very deeply about Scrum being enacted correctly, and he cared about empiricism. He cared about the team self-organizing, self-managing, and he cared about continuously improving. And because of that, he took that was his job to ensure it happened, right? And he did it for in those days, the development team, the Scrum Master, the product owner, and the organization it was working in. That's what he did. And that's the reason why the Scrum Guide described it like that. However, over time, the humbleness of the role was also important. You know, to be effective as a Scrum Master, particularly in organizations where there's a large amount of ego, you often have to come in with a humble position. You may not know the technology, you may not know the business, you may not know the challenges that are ahead of them, you may not even know the environment. You're coming in as a humble servant, as it were, and then you use that position of being humble to ultimately ask the right questions, because that's your power, right? That's the power of a great coach. One of the stances of a Scrum Master is coach. You ask the great questions, which then create the change that you require. However, you know, servant leader, and that's what servant leadership ultimately describes. It doesn't mean that you're a servant to the team, a secretary. However, the reality was people were emphasizing servant, and Ken himself hates the word servant leader or the phrase servant leader. And the reason why he hates it is because of that. He goes, I'm not a servant. There's sometimes to be successful, I have to be humble. I have to help people. I have to do things for them. That might be even organizing meetings, but I wouldn't let Ken organize any meetings, because you'll find that they'll be at midnight and you'll have to work all through till until like 6 a.m. because he's a hardworking guy. But that sometimes you'll have to do that. However, that isn't the emphasis of the role. It's a leadership role. It's about driving change. It's about ensuring that we're continuously delivering value by applying empiricism, by allowing self-management to happen, encouraging it, fostering it, and then by improving the product and how we work so that we deliver more value next time. That requires leadership, and that is crucial. So that's why it was changed. And there are a lot of agile coach is, and I don't say this in a derogative fashion, you know, I think that a good agile coach is awesome and actually looks just like a scrum master and vice versa. I don't see the real difference, but there's a lot of people that, you know, they're these crunchy, the fact that that Scrum is often used, particularly in technical organizations. They're like, oh, it's those Scrum people. They're hippies. They just want to hug and run, you know, and use liberating structures and all that. Whereas honestly, it's a very, you know, the leadership role is a powerful, hard work. You know, you're driving change, and it isn't about those huggy things at all. So I think the removal of that phrase was very influenced by the thing that you're saying, Fabian. You know, removing the emphasis on the servant and emphasizing leader, and a leader that serves. And sometimes that requires them to do stuff, you know, that you may, you know, like get the pizzas or get the coffee in or whatever. But often it requires them to ask the right questions to drive the right behavior. And some of those questions are difficult. And the next question was about what do you do if you're in that situation? Yeah, it's not easy. I think you have to, you know what Scrum would do? It would make the thing transparent. You would make it so that by not delivering the value that a Scrum Master is meant to deliver, ultimately the impact is the value that the product delivers and the success of the team, right? Now, so because of that, let's make those things transparent. Because of that, let's encourage other people to take on some of those administrative tasks, you know, like, you know, organizing the backlog, you know, blah, blah, not ordering it, but making sure it's communicated, making sure the day, you know, people arrive at the daily, etc., etc. You know, start, you know, getting the team to step up to some of that. And you do that by encouraging them, but also demonstrating what other things you can do. You know, take some impediments and say, hey, I've been thinking about this thing that's slowing us down. I've been talking to these people. I've organized this meeting, you know, Start really taking ownership of the role that you have and the responsibility. Start leading. And, you know, that requires you sometimes to make things very transparent, to provide a direction and communicate why you're doing it. Start leading though. And then hopefully your job will be more enjoyable. And if your team and your organization won't allow you to do that because you've got 27 teams or whatever, then be creative. You've got 27 teams, get 26 of them or 24 of them to run themselves. Concentrate on the 2 that have the biggest impact. Demonstrate the value you can deliver to those. You know, you're the art of the possible, guys. You know, that's Fabian, that's what it's all about, right? The art of the possible. And that sometimes as a Scrum Master means you have to, as we say in England, duck and dive, weave, and, you know, sort of like be a little bit tricky, as they say, to demonstrate that value. Because when you demonstrate great value, there's no way that they're going to put you on 27 teams.
Okay, well, Dave, I think that was a very great summary of the changes and how to implement some of them. Maybe let's take the last 5 minutes to answer a few questions if possible. So for everybody that has a question, please use the Q&A function, not the chat. We will lose track if you use the chat. So there's a button in Zoom where you have participants chat, etc. that says Q&A. And if you put your question there, you can put it in English or in Spanish. I will translate it for Dave. I will select a few the last 5 minutes. Well, let's try to answer the questions that we can handle in that time.
Yes, okay, we have a time box, right? So, which is, but we're unlike a time box though. We aren't going to finish early. So, so I guess this isn't a time box then. It would be considered to be a fixed duration.
Fixed duration,
like a sprint.
Correct. So, here's a question: what's the difference between an agile coach and a Scrum Master? I think you answer.
That's a really difficult one to answer. So it depends, right? Depends on what you mean by agile coach and what mean by Scrum Master. So one of the changes to the Scrum Guide, which we haven't mentioned, Fabian, is that roles was removed. The word roles. Now, obviously, you can still think of the 3 accountabilities as roles. I even use the word roles. It's a totally fine English word. However, the reason why it was removed and they just say accountabilities is because a lot of people equate job title with a role. Now, the Scrum Guide does not provide enough information to define a job title, to define exactly what you do in this company or this situation. What it does is it provides you with the minimum necessary for Scrum to effectively work and the accountabilities necessary to make it work. Now, so that means that it describes the sort of foundation for what a good Scrum Master or Agile coach needs to provide, but then you have to add on to it. Now, honestly, I'm not sure what the difference is between these two words, Agile coach, Scrum Master. What I do know, though, is that a good Scrum Master looks to the coaching competencies, powerful questions and things like ICF and organizations like that, to become better at enabling the team to fulfill their own potential. They also look at the facilitation techniques like liberating structures or visual facilitation. They also look to, I hate to say it, things like the PMI for things like project management techniques for visualizing and dealing with dependencies, etc. They look at the Kanban to get, so ultimately a good Scrum Master does all those things. Now you could argue that the good Agile coach does all those things. Probably the biggest, probably the most famous Agile coach job description is Spotify's, right, Fabian? They sort of like were the first people. Guess what those people were before they were Agile coaches? Scrum Masters. Do you know the reason why they added that they changed it to Agile coach? Because they realized that it wasn't just about Scrum. Now, I'm afraid to run Scrum, you have to pick up on lots of other things to run Scrum. We would say that's part of Scrum. They made the decision it wasn't, which is totally cool. And they renamed the role Agile Coach and the job description associated with that. So I actually think the two are synonyms. However, a good Scrum Master has to look for a lot more than Scrum to help the team be successful and deliver value.
That was a great answer. I think we have one more time for one more question, and it's a really good question. It's probably the most asked question I have received since the 18th of November. So there's a minor change in the Scrum Guide, and the 3 questions were removed from the daily Scrum. Now the question is, if you don't use the 3 questions, how do you do the daily Scrum?
So the 2017, they were actually optional. And the reason why they were optional in 2017 guide was because many people were using it as a industrial, traditional, people call it waterfall, but this like status report. Now, remember what the objective of the daily Scrum is. The objective of the daily Scrum is to inspect the last 24 hours so you can adapt for the next 24 hours. This opportunity to replan what's going on based on experience that you've just received, right? And so it's an opportunity with the people that are doing the work to come together and do that. So it's not a status meeting. It's not about how have you done. You're providing that information purely to allow you to get a better idea of what's going to happen next. So personally, 3 questions can still work as long as you remember that. Just because it's not in the guide doesn't mean you can't use them. However, I tend to do something slightly different. What I tend to do if I'm in a daily Scrum is I tend to bring back the goal. Hey, so the sprint goal is X. How is everybody doing against that goal? And people then bring up things that are getting in the way of the work they're doing to deliver what they think they're responsible for to deliver that goal. So I focus on the goal. Another really interesting, more work-oriented way, and Jeff talked about a little bit about this on, did an event a week ago with Jeff and Jeff Sutherland, and he talked about walking the board. And that's something we did at Task Talk where I was before. We walked the board. We walked the sprint and we looked at what was happening, and we talked about things that were looking a little bit dangerous, things that had been too long in one swim lane, or things that we knew were actually big ticket items. Maybe they had a lot of story points associated with them. So walking the board is another way. So, you know, and you can still use the 3 questions, just don't turn it into a status meeting. So 3 options. I focus on the sprint goal. That's who I am. I like the outcome oriented. Some people walk the board. Where are we at? What are the big, you know, the big rocks? What's a mess there? The third one is still using the 3 questions. But remember why we do the daily. We don't do the daily just because we like to see each other, though I like that as well. We're doing it so we can inspect and adapt on a 24-hour cadence. Inspection and adaptation. So do what's ever necessary to make things that are going wrong transparent and to allow us to replan the next 24 hours.
I think that's actually inspect and adapt. That's a great closing word, Dave. So that I would like to close the session. Thanks a lot, Dave West, for being with us, for taking the time and for explaining the changes.